Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Drive from 2011. Now, this is a movie that has been on my list for a long time, as many of these are. I should almost stop saying it at this point. But this came as memorable to me because it is right up my alley in a whole bunch of ways, and arguably it's even more up my alley now than when it first came out and when I first sort of heard about it, which I think was a little while after it came out. And so it's surprising to me that I've never gotten around to watching it, especially because it's one of those sort of cult films that is not, it's well enough known that it's a little out of the way for the mainstream viewer, but like well enough known and has a cult following that it's very well regarded. And being within a bunch of genres that I generally really like, I am surprised I've never gotten around to it. To be totally honest, I can't even remember what it was today that reminded me of it, but I was reminded of it today and was like, okay, finally time to get around to watching it. And I'm glad I did, and I wish I had before, because I really enjoyed this film. It's not perfect by any means, as no film is, but I think this is a really interesting movie, and one that, in a way, I'm actually glad I waited a little longer to watch, because especially after some of the movies that we've watched on this very show, it's given me a little bit new perspective and some new comparisons for me to make that I wouldn't have been able to make a few years ago. So where do we even start with talking about this? Actually, I think we should start with the more interesting things are going to be towards the end. But I want to start it with like praising it for its production quality, because the production is really fantastic in so many respects. This is a movie that is set in what appears to be more or less modern times, or at the time that it came out. But there are many, many elements of this film that are either what's the opposite of anachronistic? Like, they're a throwback of sorts, deliberately so, and not necessarily in a way that's unbelievable. It's not pretending like a certain era is a different era. It's simply kind of a stylistic choice and the nature of the characters that are present, that some of the things that are some of the elements present, whether it's visual or clothing or location or these other things, that already harken back to sort of the 80s. And then the rest of the movie sort of leans into that by design, with elements like music and lighting and these other things that really add to this 80s aesthetic while still being very grounded in current times. This is still a movie where characters have cell phones, even if they are mostly like flip phones, which is a little bit archaic for 2011. But it's still, very much a modern production. It's not trying to be a stylistic throwback necessarily, or a period piece, which is kind of funny, especially because this movie, just as a side tangent, is one of the primary influences for the game Hotline Miami and its sequels, which was in no small part and its success was in no small part the reason why synthwave and sort of 80s revival aesthetics showed up in the gaming industry in particular a whole bunch for a big period of time. They all kind of end up indirectly tracing themselves back to this movie, which is kind of funny. But in that respect, talking about the music, the score is fantastic for this whole film. I think it is all original score with some original songs written for it. I might be mistaken, but that's the impression I got from reading up briefly on it. It's a great score that goes from like very in your face to completely subdued or completely absent at the times that it needs to, and that works really well for a lot of the sort of tonal choices that they may make between scenes. But in terms of both adding to the storytelling and adding to a sort of a certain aesthetic, this very synth heavy sort of like soft pop, Euro pop kind of musical sound that is applied through most of the film is really key towards sort of setting the aesthetic tone, even because, not in spite of, but rather because it often clashes with what's actually happening in the movie. The movie itself really has this dichotomy between this fairly serious tone and serious subject matter that is very kind of cold and almost distant at times with some of the plot elements about criminality and these things that we'll get into in a minute. But it is put against this backdrop, both narratively of sort of these domestic and romantic elements, as well as an aesthetic that is equally sort of divergent between both this very run-down, sort of dirty, grimy, literally and figuratively underworld type of thing going on, working in sort of the crime circles, but also with this very overall hopeful tone and characters that are, have meaningful nuance to them, that give this, you can't just say this is a crime movie. You can't say it's just a driving movie or a heist movie or any of those things, because it really weaves between them in a really nice, well-balanced way. So all of that coming back to these aesthetic choices, both in the music and in some of the costuming as well, that really varies character to character, but that's like sort of the point, is that you've got these characters who are in different periods in their lives and have different levels of self-belief and delusion and all these other things. All these add feedback into the aesthetics that are chosen for these characters. So overall that sets a great tone for this whole, how do I put this? It sets a great tone overall for this multifaceted story. And that's then really fed into by the really high quality of cinematography that's all throughout this film. I have not really watched anything directed by this director before, which I'm actually surprised by because I've heard his name a lot, which is Nicholas Winding Refn, I believe. His filmography is not super long. I don't think I've seen any of it before, and it's probably the reason I haven't seen most of it is in sort of the sort of horror genres, which I don't hate, but like is usually not my go-to, and I'm a little out of touch with a lot of what happens in that genre. So to have him come do something that's a little bit different, a little bit divergent from that, really makes me consider whether I want to go watch some of his other films, because if they have anything close to the same kind of aesthetic vision that's going on here, and the type of framing and lighting and just smart cinematography all around that's going on, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see what somebody can do with that in horror, even if that's, not necessarily my favorite thing. In particular, like really, really notable, I love the lighting and the color grading and the post-processing that is done. It seems fairly limited, but it's very naturalistic, the editing that is done there. There's a lot of very, very clever, kind of subtle but kind of in your face uses of lighting, both for these beautiful aesthetic shots that are just like the lighting on someone's face and what that means for what that reinforces about what the character is going through in that moment or in that arc. These sort of moments of movement within a scene where choreography is worked along with lighting to draw the eye back and forth, even in a static shot, just using adjustments in lighting and those sorts of things to like make you look back and forth between two characters or get an impression of like what's happening, where one character is going one way and one character is going another. I think if you've already seen this film, you may know the two scenes I'm just referencing specifically with those two references there. They both happen in the same place. But there's a bunch of really nice use of lighting in general. This is not a muddy looking film. This could easily be a film that's very gray and brown, especially being set in a lot of rundown places, or a lot of dirty and dusty and kind of, it's set in LA, not in the nice parts of LA either. So, it's very much working intentionally on this dusty rundown aesthetic, but it doesn't feel the need to reinforce that with like horrible aggressive color grading that mutes color variety or anything like that. So a lot of smart work being done, both for overall tone in the lighting and the cinematography, as well as a lot of storytelling within that. I think that's a great way to transition actually into talking about the characters, because this is a really interesting cast list for a bunch of reasons. This is not like Ryan Gosling's breakout role, but it's certainly one of his big breakouts, sort of right before he became a much bigger star like he is now. I think a much more notable name. He was around for ages before. I think he was even on he was on the Mickey Mouse Club or something like that as a kid. So he's been around a long time. But as far as being like a big respected actor, this was sort of right at the beginning of that, where he's had some smaller roles, but 2011 is a big one. And this is a really interesting divergence from a lot of what I've seen him in, where often I don't think he's a particularly great actor. He's okay. He's not as like one-dimensional as I think a lot of actors in Hollywood are, but I often think he does sort of fall vaguely into that pocket of playing variations on himself. But he does have variety, and I think this reinforces more me looking at him as a more serious actor, or at least one who has more serious capacity. This isn't even the first film, this might not even be the second film that we've watched with him in it on this show, I think. Although, to be totally honest, I can't remember what the other one was, the name of it. It's gonna bother me. Somebody will put in the comments maybe. But this is a really unique and interesting role because he is very, very softly spoken, both soft spoken and short spoken in most of the film. I don't know what the total amount of dialogue he has in the film is, but it is not very much. And normally, and one of the reasons actually that I was a little skeptical going into this film is normally a character who is known for not speaking a lot is a character who is characterized as being sort of a hard ass or too cool or something like that. And it's used to sort of make them a cooler character, a more masculine, cool, calm, and collected character. And this weirdly varies up and down, I would say. This might be getting a little into tone spoilers. So if you're sensitive to that and you want to watch this film with uninfluenced, which I would recommend you do, maybe dip out here. But his performance has a huge amount of nuance to it because he has to be fairly quiet. He has to do a lot of speaking with his body language and his facial expressions in particular. And it makes for a very enigmatic character who I think because of expectations about what a character like that is typically like, I certainly had the assumption, even a decent portion through the film, of like, okay, when are we seeing the real him? You know, if this is the subdued version, what's the real him? But that's not really what they're going for at any point here. His character is much more just quiet naturally. He's not scheming grandiose schemes or like harboring some horrible, well, we'll get into that. He's not, you know, it's not him hiding something necessarily, because in actuality, the character, more often than not, seems to be a fairly soft-spoken and like emotionally soft character who really cares a lot about people. Usually the quiet masculine character is characterized as being, you know, too cool to deal with anybody. And this is very much the opposite, where his quietness is more a testament to his softness, which I think is fantastic as a sort of misdirect or a reinterpretation of that character archetype. At the same time, this is a character who has a capacity for want of a better phrase, evil and great violence. And that makes him really interesting to watch throughout, because he's an enigma kind of all the way to the end and beyond, where trying to assess his motivations is fairly clear cut. You get a very clear idea of what he sort of wants, what he cares about, what matters to him, and what he wants to do. But at the same time, watching his actions and the choices that he makes, it's hard to look at his character and not think, wait a minute, is this like somebody who's like like a sociopath, who's not recognizing the difference between who, like, is the softness, is that caringness, is that for show? Is this the kind of like psychology where somebody, you know, is performative in those things because they know it will get what they want or something like that? But that all seems, I mean, minor spoilers, I guess, by the end, it seems to be very earnest. That interest seems to be in earnest. But at the same time, it's hard to look at him and his actions, and sometimes these choices that he makes to not only commit violence but commit additional violence on top of it in order to meet his interests, meet his ends, where it's like, this is clearly still not a normal person. And it's, you know, even beyond the end of the film, I think it's still very valid to ask the questions of like, is this somebody who enjoys acts of violence? Is this somebody who is looking for opportunities to do something bad but for a good reason? Is this somebody who was from the beginning of the film to the end, I was asking myself, like, is this somebody who would want to be in the criminal side of these things, but is like sort of at odds with himself because he still feels like a good person, wants to be a good person, and wants to be on the right side of society and law and those things, but there's this enticement to be almost an action hero. And the irony of like him being a driver for movies where he's a stuntman, you know, he's not even necessarily motivated by being paid particularly well or particularly poorly, but there's, you know, you can ask a lot of questions that are never going to be answered very deliberately about his personality. Like, is he maybe like, does he see himself in a certain light as being the hero that he almost portrays in some cases? These are all sort of the things that get into the meat of his character, which continues to be an enigma throughout. I find his character so fascinating. I think it's very clear that he's neither a good guy or a bad guy. I think that's probably been, I've heard those debates go on before, and I've tuned out because I didn't want spoilers for the movie, but like, I can understand why people would be confused or make their own interpretations. I think the movie actually does a fairly good job of not trying to lean you one way or another, and even almost be a criticism of the type of violence that is so common in action films, where men who are, do grotesque acts of violence to each other are then like lauded as heroes in spite of what they've just done, because all the other elements frame them as a heroic character who like only did violence because it was what was necessary to do right. And this movie definitely gives you those moments of being like, he didn't have to do that, like, or he didn't have to be that intense, or he didn't have to be that into it, or whatever, where it's like, this is clearly not somebody who's all well, even if all of the other like text sort of tells us he's supposed to be the heroic guy we're rooting for, even up to the very, very last series of shots. He's a fascinating character, not because of necessarily even his inherent depth, but because of the questions he makes you ask about other characters, both within this movie and outside of it. Super interesting, really, really well acted by Ryan Gosling. It was a very unique performance. The rest of this cast list, though, is also really fascinating because it is a combination of a lot of like known character actors, fairly well-known stars, and then other people who were sort of on the rise at the time, but were not nearly as big as they are now. Carey Mulligan is much more well-known now than I think she was at the time. Bryan Cranston is obviously like, he's been an actor who's been around for a long time. This was after, I don't know if it was after Breaking Bad had already ended, or at least he was at least in it when this came out. Christina Hendricks, who has been sort of like a character actor for a while now, and I think also got another, when was Mad Men? Mad Men was about this same time, maybe a little earlier as well. I always remember her from Firefly because brown coats forever. Anyway, digression aside, Ron Perlman, who's been a great actor for ages, character actor. Well, I say great actor. He mostly plays variations on himself, but I really like him. He's very well cast. He picks interesting things to be in. So it's hard to fault him for that sort of thing. And then Oscar Isaac, who like was certainly on the rise at the time, but is a much, much more well-known actor for a variety of projects since then, in particular probably for being in Star Wars and a couple of other very big names since then, but like was a fairly minor, not as well-known actor at the time. And everybody on this list is like, everybody in the cast list, because this is an incomplete list, is like really, really solid, performs very well. Actually, the only disappointment is Christina Hendricks, because she actually does have very good acting chops, and her character is very, only in the movie very briefly anyway, but I don't know. It felt like some of her scenes were cut or something, but anyway, but all the actors really well cast, really well acted, all sort of served their archetypes and the subversions of their archetypes really well. God, I want to talk about particular scenes, but then I'd be here all day, and also then I have to, particularly outline a spoiler section, which I'm not going to do tonight. So anyway, what else do we have to talk about here? Man, I talked about so much just with Ryan Gosling's character. That really encompasses so much of what's interesting about this film, and also everything I said about his performance also reflects on all of the other characters. The overall plot being both a sort of a subversion of expectations, as it's not a subversion of expectations in the plot elements, it's a subversion of expectations because of the types of characters that are present and the way they execute the familiar plot beats. I think that's a pretty good summation of what's interesting about the plot and the tone. This isn't a movie that wallows in the criminality of the setting. You know, this also isn't a movie that wallows in the violence as like the draw, compared to something like Nobody, which we watched a little while back. Nobody is like kind of on this weird beat where he's the good guy, but he commits horrible acts of violence, but you still like, he's the good guy, very clear cut, those sorts of things, where it doesn't have a lot of nuance. But it's also not on the side of something like Nightwalker? Yeah, Nightwalker, which we watched even longer ago, which is very much on the like character who is really interesting in a similar kind of way, but so clearly sociopathic and like beyond understanding almost, that his behavior is almost alien, and his interests and fascinations and actions are all bizarre in this intriguing way. This is very much more grounded than something like that, but sort of balances between the two of having this weird nebulous character who is an enigma, where every turn is simultaneously expected and logical and makes perfect sense, but at the same time there's an inherent like discomfort from the audience watching him do sometimes really grotesque things that are certainly beyond what would be called like an act of self-defense or something like that. And that's what makes just so much of what's present interesting. Elements like, there are elements that they could have toned up or down, and that actually reminded me, or like when I was looking up after and finding out that Refn is known for a bunch of like horror stuff, that made a little bit more sense, because I was already thinking, going through a good chunk of this film, oh, there are real moments in this film and sequences where it's like, oh, this is shot like a horror film very deliberately. This isn't a mistake. This isn't even like just, I don't think this is even just this director's style. This was deliberately shot in such a way, and the choices are made about the plotting and about the scene, so that you get this sensation of dread that is very familiar to horror, but absent in something like action or thriller more often than not. And so the plottingness of the movie, this is a movie that doesn't have a very fast plot, despite how many things it has going on, how many characters it has going on, side plots and things, and the fact that it does have very good action sequences in it. They really aren't the focus, and everything is both in the cinematography and the pacing and all these other things shot in such a way that it's more about watching something unfold than chasing after the action. It's so interesting tonally. It's definitely the kind of thing that draws my interest enough that I'm going to probably watch this many more times in the future, because I'm fascinated by the choices that are made to give you these certain sensations that are unusual for a movie of this ilk. It's just fascinating through and through. I can also see how this movie could be gravely misinterpreted by a lot of people who either see Gosling's character, who I think is just called the driver, for in the billing. They call him Cranston's character calls him the Kid, I think, or Kid a bunch, or something like that. But like I don't think he ever has a name. What was I saying? Anyway, he's just such a fascinating character, really well portrayed and really framed in such an odd way, almost at odds with the rest of the movie that's going on around him. It just plays out in such a fascinating way. Is there anything else I want to talk about? I think that more or less covers it. Yeah. Oh, the thing, finishing the thought I was saying before, I can totally understand why there were probably a lot of people who gravely misinterpret this film, both from a like critical perspective, critics who might not get it, or normal viewers who might not get it, who might look at the character and the events that unfold and think that it's like somehow glorifying the character and calling him like heroic, or like an unmitigated hero, or like encouraging his super violence and missing the subtext and the subtleties that really show his like sort of bizarre inhumanity. I can see where people would get this one wrong a lot, but I kind of love it. It's really fascinating. Anyway, I'm going to leave before I keep saying it's interesting and it's fascinating and it's cool, because it's just really what I'm feeling at this point. Fuck. There I go. I'm saying it again. Fascinating movie. I really like it. I'll be watching it a few more times, I'm sure, sometime in the future to try and get a new interpretation and a new view on it, because it's just really solidly made. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys for something else next time.